In a word, I would say it's fragmentation. It's fragmentation of our politics. It's fragmentation of our culture. Mostly it's fragmentation of our media. We've all, in the internet era, with all of these choices, we've all gone in our separate directions. I mean, I think about how often someone will say to me, hey, are you watching this on Netflix? Are you watching this on Hulu? Are you watching this on whatever and I'm like, no, I've never even heard of it. We don't seem to have those common denominators anymore. It's except for the Super Bowl. You know, there's not like that one. We're not all watching Seinfeld. We're not all watching The Cosby Show. We just don't have common experience the way that we used to. And we're instead in our own silos and our own interests, which has been fostered by technology. The media, the high-speed internet has made it much more easy to go find people who share your passion for crochet or your passion for conservative politics, whatever it might be. And I think we've just been driven apart from one another. We're no longer the joiners that our parents had been. You know, they were in the Urban League, or they were in a church group, or they were in the local Rotary, or whatever the case may have been. In my parents' case, it was the local Moose Lodge. We've gone our separate ways. We don't have common bonds. We fight too much. And because of the fragmentation of the media, there's always somebody who's got something that's stirring that pot.
How do we become so susceptible to the fight? I mean, Americans, I sort of liken it to this age as being one of the most selfish that I can remember in my lifetime. When I look back, you know, at the various periods in which I grew up, today we seem much more self-absorbed and self-consumed about the personal affront to me and how put out I am and how put off I am by you. I'm so glad this generation is not the World War II generation, because the Nazis would have had a field day. They just would have just rolled all over everything, because there wasn't this sense. And Ukraine is sort of the through line for me as an example of what I'm talking about, because how quickly we seem to capitulate to this idea of isolationism, selfishness, because that's what isolationism is at its core. It's like, I don't give a shit about you. I'm worried about me. Why am I footing the bill for your problem, right? And so what is it that drives that? I mean, it's not just Trump pricking that scab. That scab was there. That wound is, in my view, has been there a long time. But what is it about this period now where we seem so much more interested in leaning into that? And it's not just here, it's globally. I mean, this march towards authoritarianism is not just a U.S. thing. We're watching them, sort of stomp across Europe right now as well.
Brexit preceded Donald Trump's 2016 election. I think that was sort of the canary in the coal mine. It's funny you mentioned Ukraine in the same context as all of this, because there's a story a couple of days ago about the Biden administration putting pressure on Ukraine to lower the age for mandatory conscription from 25 to 18. And I talked about it on radio, and I talked about it in the context of, what if we needed our 18-year-olds? And I don't want to be Mr. Wilson, the old curmudgeon, hey, Dennis, get off my lawn. Although I guess in some ways I've become that person. But if you and I were having a conversation and it were the late 1930s, to go back to your Nazi reference, and we were talking as parents about kids today, I don't know what we would be saying about those who were about to become the greatest generation. Pearl Harbor happens. They go fight the Nazis. They fight the Japanese. I mean, would they have been complaining about men who were adrift or kids who lacked ambition? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that today I'm very worried, and I'm worried about the lack of cohesion of all age groups. I think if you look at the social science and the political science, and I'm thinking of Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, and I'm thinking of Bill Bishop in The Big Sort and books like that, they talk about a disconnect that followed Vietnam and then a re-engagement in the internet era where it became much easier to spend time with the like-minded, whether it was politics, whether it was business, whether it was your hobby. And now we've got a generation that's intent on creating experiences behind closed doors that are just not legitimate. They're just not real. And we're not together instead and rubbing shoulders, getting to know people who are outside our tribe, whatever it might be. To me, this is the biggest issue of our time. I've been on the road this year, 14 states, 2 countries, some of those 14 states multiple times, delivering what I call the Mingle Project. And at its core, it is a plea for us to figure out how, through church, through volunteerism, through participation in our community, support of local newspapers, we put this society back together again.
Do people want to do that?
Yeah, man. Michael, you cannot imagine the chord that it has struck when I explain to people with the data that we actually have much more in common than our politicians and our media so-called leaders want us to believe. The Hidden Tribes study showing that 86% of us don't rest at the polar extremes. The fact that still the highest level of self-reporting is as independent, not as Democrat, not as Republican. If you look at Morris Fiorina's Unstable Majorities, the conclusion of that book says there hasn't been a sea change in the last 50 years on the issues. In other words, if you look at the death penalty, even abortion, the size of the societal safety net, we're pretty much where we were in the 1970s. But my God, to turn on television or the radio or go to the internet, you'd swear we're all on one side or the other, and we're way the hell apart.
That is so true. That's a fair point. So that opens up for me the next question then to you, because you've got 2 great podcasts, which I highly recommend to everyone. They again, typical Smerconish engagement, folks. You're going to learn something, you're going to be smarter, but you're also going to test your own thinking. The Smerconish Podcast, and I'm really interested in the book club with Michael Smerconish, because those kind of set up 2 different conversations, but there is some linkage. What do you hear when you translate, folks who are engaged in your podcast versus those who are engaged through the book club, particularly in the age of where folks are like, yeah, let's burn that book. let's not, I don't want my kids reading Huckleberry Finn,
So can I tell you that like 20 years ago, man, I've been around the horn. There was a time period when I was guest hosting Hardball for Chris Matthews, which is when we first met. Yep. And in the same 5 years, I was guest hosting for Bill O'Reilly's Radio Factor. And Michael, I would walk between the Fox News building and 30 Rock on 6th Avenue, going from one show to the other, hosting them both on the same day. And I would be thinking, I'm either going to get shot in the chest or shot in the back as I'm going between these 2 worlds. So in that era, CNN came to me and they said, hey, we like you. We don't know what to do with you. Do you have an idea for a show of some kind? And I think they were really surprised when I said, yeah.
That sounds so much like CNN, though.
Don't get me in trouble. Don't get me in trouble. So I said to them, I'd like to actually host a show, which would be a weekly book club. And they're like, what? You want to host a book club? We thought you were going to talk politics. I'm like, no. On my radio show, I interview so many authors and I get totally engaged in different subjects. And so they shot a pilot and then they never picked up the show. But over the years, I've done so many author interviews all across the spectrum, fiction, nonfiction, front page stuff, shits and giggles kind of stuff. Right. And I've enjoyed some of those author interviews. And so we started to release them as podcasts and they really struck a chord. And then we finally decided, hey, let's just roll out the Michael Smerconish Book Club podcast. We do it 3 times a week. So for example, Peggy Noonan was my guest on Monday. We released that as a book club podcast. Yeah. And they're each like 20 minutes long. You can take me for a walk. And that is where my passion is.
Oh, I love it, man. You, like I said, you get some really, really engaging folks in conversations that are really outside of in one sense, outside of the crazy mainstream coverage that we see. These storylines that impact on, behavior and culture and attitudes. And the sciences, the arts, music, those features, I think, in many respects, that have defined us generationally, how we identify ourselves. We could talk about the music of the 1990s or the 1960s or, the turn of the century. We can talk about how the arts like theater and TV in competition with each other actually found a rapprochement, if you will, and sort of figure out how one plays off of the other. Today, though, it just seems to be everything has got to be at odds. And so to have a space where people, and that's what I try to do here, just have a space where people can have a damn conversation.
Totally.
I don't care whether you agree with me or disagree. I just want you to listen.
Look, on a typical day like today, I'm going to talk about Joe pardoning Hunter. Of course I am.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment.
I figured. So, and there's going to be the usual left-right kind of push and pull on that, which is fine. But at some point, I'm always looking for the conversation starter where it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, a Democrat, white, black, male, female. I'll give you one. There was a great piece this past holiday weekend in the Washington Post. It was so well written. 52 airplane rules of etiquette. And It was so funny, and yet it made some real points. I mean, so one of the authors
was the damn shoes off.
Don't take your shoes. Exactly. Don't take your shoes off. And by the way, whoever is in the middle seat, for God's sakes, give them both armrests. Because after all, they're sitting in the middle seat.
Right.
So Michael, I went through, a bunch of these 52 rules with one of the co-authors from the Washington Post. It was hysterical. And like everybody responded, and it didn't matter what party you came from. It was just a good unifying conversation. And I am forever looking for those water cooler kind of conversations.
So on that point, every day on your show, you poll your audience. You want to know, okay, folks, so let me test. Like I said before, you're the guy who puts your finger on the pulse to see if you're still breathing, right?
Right.
And so you do that every day. What have you learned in doing that from the American people? In light of what you just said, that, when you start breaking down airport, airline, sort of etiquette, people kind of forget they're Democrats, they forget they're Republicans, they forget they're black, they forget they're white. What they're annoyed about is that I got the middle seat. Can I at least have one?
Right. Yeah. It's been a great example of the ties that bind, right? Instead of everything being so divisive. And that is what I've learned. I've learned that there's still far more that unites us than divides us, and that the people who want to keep us divided have either a profit motive or a self-preservation motive because they want to keep their gigs in Washington, D.C.
And they typically align.
Yes, of course. It's like this symbiotic relationship where they're laughing all the way to the bank or laughing all the way to re-election. And so I'm sort of on a crusade to let people know you got to change the channel, mix up your media diet. And if you are something that's not far left or far right, it's okay. There are plenty others just like you.
We still love you, boo. We still love you.
Right.
You.